Syd of Valis for the Sega Genesis is an action platformer starring a student named Yuko that leads a double life as the warrior of Valis. This story picks up after the events of the first game in the series, just as Yuko seems to be getting back to her normal life again. The instruction manual comes with a great little comic strip to establish the circumstances that set the new adventure into motion, and I thought that this was the perfect way to catch up someone like me who hasn't played the first Valis game. The long story short is that there's been a resurgence of evil in the form of a new emperor, and from beyond the grave, Yuko's friend Rico calls to her to take up her sword to battle once again. In addition to the comic, there are some introductory scenes that play before the title screen, but they desperately lacked information to set the stage. When I first watched these, all I took away from them was that a little girl was accosted by a strange man in the street, followed by her ice cream cone transforming into a sword. Huh? If you've played the first game, then obviously you'll recognize some of the characters and names that were carried over, but as a first-time Valis player, these cutscenes left me scratching my head. This is probably also a good time to mention the tonal shift from another Valis II release on the TurboGrafx CD. The two games follow the same story more or less, but the TurboGrafx CD version's beginning has a completely different feel and establishes way more tension and excitement. While it's expected that super deformed games like Syd of Valis will lean more towards a cutesy and lighthearted mood, this switch somehow managed to strip almost all of the cinematic spirit out of the storytelling experience. This goes well beyond the fact that the TGCD version is voice acted and was capable of a better audio-visual experience compared to the Genesis, but a big part of what I feel is missing comes from the simplistic and error-filled translation in Syd of Valis. So much dialogue is just simply missing altogether, and what there is bare bones at best. It really dampened the impact of what's truly a compelling story about a girl saving the world. Once you finally gain control of Yuko, the gameplay is exactly what you'd expect from an action platformer where you move through each of the stages and eliminate the enemies that you come across. The evil minions here look and feel big and bright, and they had some entertaining moments while attacking you. These ferocious, fire-spitting slimes were my favorite of the bunch, but many of the enemies were really creative and fun to watch while getting beaten up. The best of all though was Yuko. Her walk and battle cycles were fluid, and I especially loved her cute idle animation where she smiles at you. Seeing her expression change in the user interface area was also a really nice touch, although there wasn't much variety apart from happy or grumpy. I was initially worried about having such a large character to guide around, since a bigger sprite usually means a bigger hitbox, but since enemies were just as big if not bigger than Yuko, the difficulty felt surprisingly balanced. It also helped that weapons could be fired in all directions rather than just on the horizontal plane, since foes also had the advantage of attacking from all angles. Other than a few fast-moving enemies here and there, the game's pacing felt to be more on the slower side overall, so I was able to take my time and plan my attacks. With no timer to deal with, it was easy enough to learn the level layouts and where things were going to pop up. The path through each stage was set with very little to find in terms of secrets. Other than a few power-ups or extra lives stashed away at the fringes of some of the more vertical areas, there was nothing hidden out of plain sight. The surroundings were varied enough to keep things feeling fresh, but sections needing precise platforming were punishing, to put it lightly. Yuko either moves like a sack of bricks or at 1,000,000 kilometers an hour, and there's very little in between. I constantly over and undershot my jumps because of the wily controls, especially on moving targets. Thankfully, there weren't too many sections like that to muddle through. Inconsistencies did pop up here and there, like how sometimes falling into a pit would damage you and other times it wouldn't, like this one spot in Stage 3. At least falling into a bottomless pit was an insta-death like many other games, so I can't really complain. Each level has at least one boss to face off with, and defeating them was the only way to get your hands on upgrades. What's really neat is that you can switch between the different weapons and costumes at any time, and this even includes during a cutscene or a boss fight if you need to. The instruction manual put a lot of emphasis on how many of the costumes were brand new for this version of the game, but at the same time skimmed on details about their stats or practicality. The attack and defense stats and how they were calculated with different weapon and costume combinations was downright mind-boggling at first. When you look at this inventory screen, you'd think that A is for attack power and D is for defense, right? Well, according to the manual, it's the opposite. I only have myself to blame for not knowing this because I didn't read this section before I started, but to be fair, these values seemed self-explanatory because of conventions from other games I've played. Apparently not. Even though the manual insisted that I wouldn't have to fear enemies anymore once I got the best costume, many of the bosses here felt very, very tough. When I said that the large sprite size of regular enemies didn't bother me much, I really meant that, but bosses were an entirely different story. Some of them had really small hitboxes and very difficult patterns to outmaneuver, and a few of them were so big that I couldn't reliably clear them even with the double jump move. The difficulty curve was all over the place too. Even the very first boss killed me a bunch of times before I lucked out by hammering my weapon, but others felt like pushovers mixed in with totally daunting adversaries. Later bosses with multiple forms felt impossible without finding a safe spot to spam the homing weapon, and to me, it didn't feel like the difficulty built up fairly or in a way that felt meaningful. Oddly enough, the final boss battle was probably one of the easiest for me to get through, and it was really cool. With the backdrop of what I'd consider the best music track in the whole game, it was the first time that something felt truly ominous. It's a shame that that sentiment came so late, and unfortunately it didn't last long, since after the fight's over, you're rewarded with a confusing, broken English ending sequence as a cherry on top of this weird little game. There were some other quirks that I feel are worth mentioning. First of all, even though a lot of the text was roughly translated into English, the game over screen, ending credits, and the ending screen are still in Japanese. Even stranger yet is that the main character is clearly described as Yuko in the manual and on the box, but people in the game constantly refer to her as Syd, and there's no explanation for this. Speaking of the box, who are all these people on the front cover? Nobody has golf clubs or lasers or spaceships in this adventure, and after a little digging, it's really clear that this art was ripped straight from a PC Engine game where Yuko's one of the playable characters. Where are Rico, Migas, Valna, and Valia? Or even Vacanti, even though I still don't really know if that's a person or a place since this localization was so fuzzy. There are a lot of questions left unanswered about the goings-on in this game, and the entire project seems truly bizarre. As a standalone game, I would consider Syd of Valis to be an average action platformer with a likable sword-swinging hero and just enough of a story to keep you hooked. As an entry in the Valis series though, it's nothing short of peculiar. While the action is good and the enemies in the world are imaginative enough, its quirks and especially poor localization make it feel unpolished and hold it back from reaching anywhere close to top-tier status. The TurboGrafx CD and MSX versions of Valis II offer something completely different, but for anyone wanting a quick quest to help a young woman get back to her favorite snack, the Genesis game is the perfect fit.